in Berwick 900 way back in 2015, and I have very clear recollections and memories of the First World War weekend that we held in the Guildhall, and my youngest daughter doing military drill with John outside the Guildhall. Rosie, like myself, is not from the Northeast, but has adopted it as her home and has lived here for nearly 40 years. Although originally working with young homeless women and as a fuel poverty campaigner, Rosie decided to change direction in 2008 and follow her lifelong love of history. She has co-authored a number of books with John and is presently a tutor with the WEA. Rosie's passion is bringing history to life through the stories of individuals. These involve carrying out a lot of research and delving into archives to find those untold stories, something which I know as an archivist is totally magical and makes it all worthwhile. Rosie uses this information to help bring history to life and let people step into other people's shoes. She complements John's interest in military history with her interest in the social and domestic side of it. Now, fittingly tonight, this talk is being run in association with Berwick Heritage Open Days, hence the H's behind me. This is one of the other autumn festivals run in Berwick, and it happens in September, and it celebrates the heritage in all its many guises, including buildings, archives, and culture. And obviously, Berwick is full of all those things. And I act as the chair of the steering group that run it. And now, for the real reason why you're here tonight, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to both John and Rosie to give their talk entitled Cromwell's Convicts, the Death March from Dunbar in 1650. Now, this looks at the fate of the Scottish Covenanters defeated by Oliver Cromwell in 1650 at this battle and then forced to march south to Dunbar. This isn't a period of history or an event which was well known or even really acknowledged until recently. So now I'm going to hand over to John and Rosie. John is going to start the talk and speak for the first 20 minutes, and then he'll hand over to Rosie to do the next bit. So I'll hand over to you, John.
Good evening, Linda. Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. I hope everyone can hear me all right. If you hear any sirens on my end of the recording, they probably are coming for me because I don't live near a hospital. Now, Oliver Cromwell wrote to the Scottish Parliament in the early months of 1650, before the commencement of hostilities, with his famous expression, I beseech you in the bowels of Christ, think that you may be mistaken. But what would they be mistaken about? This, it was, of course, toward the end of what we now rightly call the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. The civil war was sought out right across the whole of the British Isles, including, of course, Ireland, which was part of Great Britain at that time. The Scottish Covenanters, of course, the Scots had signed the Solemn League and Covenant in 1638 to defy Lord's liturgy in defiance of their King Charles I. The Scots and English had been allies for most of the Civil War period. The Scots had campaigned in England in 1640 during the Second Bishops' War and won the Battle of Newburn. In late 1643, John Pym, then dying of stomach cancer, had brokered an arrangement, an undertaking with the Scottish Estates, that the army of the Solemn League and Covenant, a superbly raised, drilled and led force, would weigh in on the side of Parliament beginning early in 1644. This, he hoped, would break the deadlock between King and Parliament. Now, the Scots did not come out of conviction. They came for pay. They were mercenaries. They were to be paid for the intervention of their armed forces. And their army was led by Alexander Leslie, the Earl of Leven, a seasoned veteran who'd learned his trade in the days of Gustavus Adolphus during the 30 Years' War on the continent. This partnership between the English and the Scots had generally been successful. The Scots fought, not perhaps with distinction, but certainly fought at Marston Moor, and they were responsible for taking Newcastle by storm in the autumn of 1644. The king had, of course, surrendered to the Scots, rather cunningly perhaps, in 1646, and a party in Scotland called the Engagers had come into being, led and championed by the Duke of Hamilton. Hamilton wanted to engage with Charles, and in 1648 he led a significant Scottish army down the west side of England, which ran into a fairly substantial roadblock engineered by Cromwell and Lambert at Preston. The Scottish army was destroyed, and Hamilton's last journey was to the block. The Kirk, under Argyll, regained supremacy in Scotland. So far, so good. The main problem was that Parliament had not consulted their Scottish allies when they decided to cut off the king's head. Now, of course, Charles was also King of Scotland. His father had, of course, been James VI of Scotland. He was a steward. And the other Scots might have fought against him, though they believed he'd been trying to oppress their ancient liberties. He was still their king. That didn't give Parliament the right to cut off his head without even asking. This was a major blunder, of course, on Parliament's part, not to consult the Scots. The fallout meant that the Scots began to look at and perhaps to think about entering into an arrangement with Charles II. And Charles II was a different man to his father, apart from the fact he was a foot taller. He was much wilier, much more clever, and perhaps more charismatic. He, of course, had nothing whatsoever in common with the Covenanters. Any arrangement between them would be based on significant cynicism on both sides. But Charles was happy to sacrifice his great paladin, Montrose, and finally come to rather shaky terms with Argyll. This was certainly not what a lot of Scots wanted. Many Scottish officers, perhaps many of the rank and file, felt uncomfortable with the idea of fighting for one king having fought against his father. Cromwell certainly appears from his correspondent not to wish to have entered into a war with Scotland, not at that time. England was bankrupt, of course, ruined by the years of war. Scotland wasn't in much better shape. And Cromwell had just returned from campaigning in Ireland, where his army had taken a fair pounding. Many of the men who came back with him carried sickness and wounds alongside. So even if, as some suggest, Cromwell entertained a grander vision of integrating Scotland and England into some kind of effective United Kingdom, anticipating the Union of Parliaments by the Act of Union by over half a century, this wouldn't be entirely surprising. After all, Charles and James before him had entertained such a vision. The Scots were naturally rather reluctant to see their independence destroyed. As a result, then, the Scots opted to go with Charles II, and Cromwell, with some reluctance, was forced to gather an army, perhaps 16,000 strong, who mustered in Northumberland, Chillingham, and then began the long march north. The Scots, too, struggled to raise an army. The enthusiasm and national outpouring which had greeted the Covenant in 1638 had long since withered in the rain. Conscripts were few and far between in 1615. The Scots had an excellent system of raising conscript through the various county committees. Nonetheless, finding enough young men to fill the ranks was extremely difficult. Moreover, the Covenant had purged a number of those who previously served and officers for their generally ungodly behaviour. And the Kirk had imposed upon the army a whole raft of what in the Second World War would have been called political commissars, priests, whose job was to ensure not just the moral well-being of the troops, but actually to direct policy, which could often lead to disastrous results. Once again, Leslie, Earl of Leven, would command the Scottish army. And he preferred a Fabian strategy. He preferred to wear Cromwell down, avoid fighting Cromwell in the field. In the field, he was probably unbeatable. But he fortified Edinburgh, he fortified Leith. He created a vast system like the lines of Thomas Ardres in front of Edinburgh, which defied all of Cromwell's efforts. The summer campaign was the most unsatisfactory one from Oliver's point of view. He struggled, his army struggled in the foul weather, which was typical of summers during the course of civil wars. He could not breach Leven's lines. He was constantly harassed by David Leslie, who was the field commander, and his hard-riding, fast-striking moss troopers, who were grandsons of the old Border Reivers, perhaps. As summer waned, early in September, Cromwell found himself back at the port of Dunbar with what was left of his army, perhaps 12,000 men. Many were sick, a number were injured. The force, his infantry, cavalry, and artillery, bunkered down within the walls or in the fields around the town. He might have hoped the fleet, in a kind of mini Dunkirk, might have been able to lift him off the beaches or from the harbour. The situation was that grave. David Leslie, with his army, was following close and took up a watching position on Doon Hill above the town. It's a very commanding position, completely safe from attack, but is of itself isolated, extremely cold and wet, and not suitable in tactical terms to achieve what Leslie was probably trying to achieve. What Leslie wanted to do was to bring his forces down closer to the town and seal off any chance Cromwell might have of slipping by along the coast and making his way back to Berwick in safety. All this time, Leslie was simply thinking about being the cork in the bottle, sealing Cromwell to his doom, thinking that the English might in fact either surrender or simply try and get their infantry and wounded off by boat, and the cavalry break out across the land. His position along the banks of the Broxburn was happily suited for this purpose. He could easily interdict any attempt by the English to break out. It was, however, a very poor defensive position if he himself was attacked. Then he might find himself in difficulties. He didn't think he would be attacked. He didn't think Cromwell and his army had enough spirit left in them to mount an attack. However, he was mistaken. Lambert it was probably who, looking at the Scottish position on the 2nd of September, thought it's possible, just possible, that leading with his cavalry, Cromwell could strike a major blow across the stream and destroy the right flank of Leslie's army. If he could do that, if he could push aside Leslie's cavalry, his infantry battalions, his regiments, would effectively be rolled up in line. Leslie does not appear to have thought this might happen because that night, another miserable wet night, many of his officers had deserted the field to seek comfortable billets, and the men had extinguished their matches, essential for firing cumbersome matchlock muskets. The next day, however, Cromwell attacked. His cavalry came across the burn against all expectations, followed by infantry, his infantry brigades or tercios. There was a savage fight, but the Scots army was scattered, the cavalry was scattered to the winds, and Cromwell simply rolled up the line. Leslie's army was utterly defeated. Quite a few regiments managed to get away, but something in the order of 10,000 prisoners were taken. Now, Cromwell gives us a figure of 10,000. It's a bit of a round number, but probably not far wrong. Cromwell immediately separated those into two categories. Half of them were either wounded men too badly wounded to continue fighting, or civilians, non-combatants, or soldiers' wives. All of those, let's say half the total, he instantly paroled and effectively sent them home. The other half, the relatively young, fit men, he did not release. They were prisoners of war. Now, he kept them as prisoners for two main reasons. The first reason was he did not want these men breaking their parole and rejoining the ranks. He thought it was quite possible that Charles and the Kirk could raise yet another army, and he might have to fight them again. He was right, of course. 1651, Charles did raise another army, and therefore Cromwell was denying the use of those 5,000 men to him. Cromwell, on the 3rd of September 1651, had to go back and do it all again at Worcester. So the 5,000 men had to be kept out of reach of the Cavaliers. At the same time, they could be a useful cash crop. He could make money from his prisoners. He could sell them on as mercenaries. The French were clamouring for men. He could send them across to Ireland to form garrisons. The Scots had even less love for the Irish, by and large, than the English. Or he could use them effectively as forced labour. He could use them as a marketable commodity. These men were now merchandise. It's surprising, in those circumstances, he didn't take better care of his stock. Now, what he planned, of course, he couldn't hold the men at Dunbar. He planned to march them south to a suitable holding point, that holding point being Durham City. That's quite a long way. And the march would take over a week, made by a series of daily stages. At no point during the march were the men fed or watered. It was, from the start, a death march. It is said that Cromwell only had a single troop of dragoons, perhaps 30 or 40 men, as security, though this seems ridiculously small. We know right from the start, however, that anybody who fell out, anybody who tried to escape, anybody who simply showed the wrong attitude was shot on the spot. There was no mercy. And we know from Heselrigg and other commentators the Scots also fought among themselves. Any man who had a crust or a coin about him stood a good chance of being murdered by his fellows. On the first day, they were marched from Dunbar to Berwick. Now we know some people died at Berwick. These included 2 women who are recorded as being Scottish. This is somewhat intriguing. We don't know if these were camp followers who had followed the men. We don't know their circumstances, and we don't know how and why they died. From Berwick, the next day's march was on to Belford, about 15 miles a day in stages. From Belford down to Alnwick, from Alnwick down to Morpeth. Remember, by now the men have had no food and no water other than what they could get from puddles and streams by the way. They were starving. They hadn't been fed for several days before the battle. In Morpeth, they were quartered in and around the castle. Now, of course, today all that's left of the castle is the gatehouse. There were a number of cabbage patches which had been planted out. The men grubbed up the cabbages, roots and all, and ate them, wolfed them down. Why not? They were starving, eat anything. This was, in fact, not the end of their troubles, but in some ways just the beginning. As a result of this, either dysentery or typhus began to spread among the ranks. By the time they reached Newcastle, where they were billeted in the cathedral, the burgesses had to pay out a substantial sum to have the cathedral cleaned. The sheer amount of human waste was considerable. From Newcastle, they were marched to Chesley Street, and then from Chesley Street to Durham. Any who saw the towers of Durham Cathedral appearing as they marched closer might have thought that their ordeal was over. It wasn't. It was very far from over. The medical conditions which they brought with them, let's say it was dysentery, began killing men at an alarming rate. We know all about this because of the long exculpatory letter that Heselrigg, as governor, writes to Parliament. The fact is, every time a man dies, that's part of the cash crop written off. And we know a lot died. The cathedral, of course, was no longer a place of worship. Like all main churches, the altars had effectively been stripped by Parliament. It was simply used as a warehouse in which to store this human cargo. The conditions, as autumn led into winter, were abominable. Men began dying in droves. Heselrigg and such medical services as he had, which were contained within the castle, were soon hopelessly overwhelmed. And many, many men began to die. This is Durham's dirty secret. Those men were buried on Palace Green, this wonderful, calm centre of academic excellence which we see today, with marvellous buildings ranged around it. Underneath those buildings are the remains of probably 2,500 Scots who died as a result of deliberate negligence on the part of their captors. Cromwell cannot escape blame for this. He failed to make provision for his prisoners. If we simply look at the numbers, this is one of the worst war crimes, one of the worst atrocities in British history. The Civil War did, it has to be said, contain quite a number of atrocities, many, of course, of which were committed in Ireland, where the normal rules of war did not apply. But of these 2,500 men who died, we know virtually nothing. We know nothing about them, and nothing was really discovered about them until such time as the remains of some of these men were found during excavations on Palace Green, where the red arrow is showing on the slide, in 2013. And paring away the ground to expose the remains of some of these men opened up a window onto this past event, a window which showed how these young men, and they were mainly young, had died, how they had simply been heaped into mass graves and forgotten about. Durham's dirty secret contained beneath the range of academic buildings constructed later. But the truth, as they say, will out, and the superb work done by archaeologists and academics following the examination of the bodies has shed tremendous light on how these young men lived and how they died. But one thing's for sure, when those 5,000 men marched away from Dunbar on the afternoon of the 3rd of September in the rain, it's almost certain that none of them ever saw their homes again. Thank you very much. I'm handing over to Rosie.
Hello. Any of you who ever saw the film Captain Blood will have heard of the idea of indentured servitude. In that film, Errol Flynn and his friends are sent off to the Indies. It was the fate of the men from Dunbar. In their case, though, it was the Americas rather than the Indies. It was not unusual for large numbers of prisoners of war to be transported in this way. In fact, it was very commonplace. The numbers transported from Ireland during Cromwell's campaigns there are said to have reached as high as 10,000. Whoops, I've gone too far. What you've got in front of you now is an order to pick up any stray Irish who've been driven away from their homes by the fighting and were therefore entitled to be treated as vagabonds and transport them. It was a profitable business. Take a look at this name. You're going to encounter him again as we talk about what happened to the Dunbar men in the Americas. The trade would go on for a very long time. It didn't cease with the end of the Commonwealth. Hundreds in the late 17th century were consigned to Jamaica, but most were shipped to Virginia and Maryland. We know of at least 4,500 pardoned for the colonies between 1661 and 1700. And they weren't just men. Women and children also had a value, not least as a means of persuading male colonists to stay. If they had somebody to marry, they had the means of settling down and starting a family. That ties you to the land very effectively. Very often, it would be a 2-for-1 offer. A man taking on a maid would expect to pay about £120 of tobacco for her, but could get an apprentice, usually a child, for only another £20. Between 1620 and 1775, it's estimated that some 300,000 self-indentured servants, free willers as they were called, arrived in the Americas, 2 out of 3 migrants from the British Isles. It was to be repeated after the Battle of Worcester a year later, when another 8,000 men were taken captive, and they, like their friends before them, were shipped away. It was a dangerous business just getting to the colonies. Shipboard mortality ranged between 15 to 30%, and neither did it get any safer after they got there. Within a 5-year period after landing, around 35% of women and 50% of men would be dead. That was between 1620 and 1680. It didn't stop the business becoming a major industry, with shipments of up to 200 at a time being sent overseas. We know about 2 of the ships that took the men we're interested in, the Sarah and the Unity, 2 ships carrying these Scots prisoners whose records remarkably have survived. On November the 11th, 1651, Hazelrig was told to deliver 150 prisoners to Augustine Walker, who would take them to New England. The Unity sailed in the winter rather than waiting for spring, so the trip was rough, and you can imagine conditions on board. Most of the prisoners had scurvy. Many of them were in poor health following their march, but nonetheless, they all arrived safely in Boston near the end of December. We don't have a comprehensive list for the Unity. What we do have is the information put together by the Scottish Prisoners of War Society, an American organisation comprised of the descendants of the Dunbar men. They've got at least 180 names that they think probably comprised the men who travelled there that time. But what of the people left behind? Those wives and families who were every bit as much a casualty of war as the men who were transported. There was no established funding mechanism to look after them or to care for families who'd been left destitute. Women were required to throw themselves on the mercy of the church. For the families of the prisoners, there was nothing but the anguish of waiting, and many would live out their lives and go to their graves, not knowing where their husbands, fathers, brothers, sons were alive or dead. In the wake of Dunbar, the commissioners of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland organised a day of national fasting and atonement for what was seen as God's displeasure. Rather more helpfully, individual parishes began collecting donations. We know about some of the women who applied for that financial help. Helen Smith, widow of John Young, killed at Dunbar, appealed to her Kirk in Culross. They awarded her 12 shillings a month, probably about the best that she could hope for. Some women would want to remarry, but would have no idea if their husband was dead or alive. As late as 1655, the Synod of Fife was debating the position and deciding that a war widow either had to obtain clear evidence of her husband's death or seek a declaration from the courts to that effect. We know of at least a couple of men who settled in America and who married and established other families, who had left wives and surviving children behind them. Many of the Scots who travelled on the Unity were assigned to businesses in Maine and Massachusetts. The brokers of the voyage had an interest in this business, and it was they who arranged for the men to be transported here. At least 62 of the Scots are known to have been sent to the Saugus Ironworks at Lynn in Massachusetts, one of the first iron manufactories in North America. We know a great deal about Saugus because it's now a living history museum, rather like the one at Beamish here in Northumberland, a place where you can go and step inside the lives of people who lived so long ago. The rest of the men from the Unity were sold as indentured servants to local residents working in the area around the ironworks. It was a profitable business. The indenture, which was meant to last for about 7 years, cost between £20 to £30 per man, depending on how skillful he was. At the end of that time, the idea was that they would be released and would be able to settle and create new lives in the areas where they'd ended up. The typical cost for transporting them across the sea was £5. So the voyage of the Unity, for example, was an extremely profitable one, clearing about £1,500 in profit. That's worth about £105,000 in today's terms. We know that survivors from Dunbar were sold into forced labour in mines, forges, mills and plantations right across New England, as well as elsewhere in the Americas. Some did well. Many years later, one of the Scots who settled in New Jersey from around 1680 onwards wrote home that he'd had a drink with what he described as one of the old buckskin planters. This was a Scot who, he said, had been sent away by Cromwell to New England as a slave from Dunbar and was now living in Woodridge like a Scottish laird. The man, he said, wished his native Scots and his native soil very well, though he never intends to see it again. Richard Leader, who we saw mentioned in the Irish transportation documents, was an English businessman. Whoops, I slipped away again. He was an English businessman engaged in the trade between America, England, and Scotland. He had a direct interest at Saugus. In fact, until 1651, he was responsible for managing it. In that year, he resigned with his brother and began the operation of an alternative mill on the nearby Great Works River at Kittery, also in Maine. Leader brought with him his bond prisoners from Saugus. The ownership of these men was personal rather than institutional. If you moved on, then your bondsman would move on with you. 5 years later, he sold out his interests there, and he freed his servants, many of them those bonded labourers. Many of them settled down in Kittery, taking up land grants there, and started to think about establishing their lives again. It wasn't an unfamiliar environment for many of them. In fact, they found themselves in some very familiar company. The Congregationalists of New England shared many of the beliefs of the Scots Presbyterians, but there were some striking differences as well. The Puritans, the Presbyterians of New England, had a slightly different worldview from the Scots. It's a bit entertaining given our take on Calvinism these days, when we think of the whole thing as being very dour and rather unforgiving. But there's plenty of evidence that Puritan New England viewed its new Scots intake as morally slack. The Innes trial is a prime example of that. It's one of those times when we find two groups of Cromwell's deportees meeting up. Alexander Innes was one of the Unity men who served his time at the Saugus Works. He seems to have settled in Taunton, Massachusetts, where he married an Irish woman, Catherine Briggs. We don't know whether she was one of the Irish transported by Cromwell in the wake of his Irish expedition, but it seems like a strong possibility. We're told that an Irish woman, Catherine Innes, by this time, was brought before the court at Plymouth in February 1656 upon suspicion of committing adultery. We've actually got the court records, and they make slightly odd reading to modern eyes. We've actually translated the mod text into modern English to make it a little bit easier to follow. Basically what we're told, oops, gone too far again. What we're told is that another Scot, a man called William Paul, who we think may well have been one of the Unity or the Sarah men, was caught in filthy and unclean behaviour with the wife of Alexander Innes. In other words, they were carrying on. Catherine and Alexander were sentenced to be publicly whipped. And Catherine was also sentenced to wear a red B on the sleeve of her dress, probably B for board. Any of you who've read Hawthorne's novel, The Scarlet Letter, will be familiar with this particular form of punishment. It's a way of imposing lifelong humiliation. There's no end to the time that the victims of this particular punishment are required to wear their mark of shame. Alexander Innes also got caught up in this. Initially called to serve as a witness at the trial, he was very swiftly to find himself in the dock as well. A husband was held to be responsible for his wife's behaviour. And as far as the court was concerned, it was all Alexander's fault for leaving his woman to her own devices, because everyone knows that women, the daughters of Eve, are totally incapable of controlling themselves. Or at least that's what the court had to say. So Alexander Innes too was punished, sentenced to sit in the docks during the period of the whipping of his wife and her lover, and to pay the court costs for all three of them. We don't know what became of them. They seem to have remained in the area, and we have a record many years later of a will in which Alexander and his wife Catherine leave substantial property to their descendants. But what their lives were like between this incident and then, we may never know. These men are remembered in all sorts of ways in New England and other parts of America now. At Saugus, there is a memorial that's been put up both to the men who worked there, but also to those who inhabited a building built specially for them next door to the works. And there are, of course, the histories of their descendants, and there are many of them. This is a record of Thomas Ranny, another one of the Dunbar men, who settled in the area and, as you can see, managed to produce quite a sizable family. If you look at the subsequent marriages that are listed here, you begin to get an idea of just how the ramifications of this group of visitors would spread out across the states. The calculation now is that there are somewhere around 250,000 descendants of these men. And we have a remarkable amount of information about many of them because of the work done by the Scottish Prisoner of War Societies. One of the joys of the book that John and I put together about this was getting in touch with some of those descendants. Many of them returned to England to have a look at the exhibition that was put up after the discoveries at Durham in 2013, and to attend some of the reenactments at Dunbar. And others got in touch when they heard about the work we were doing to talk about their lives and the sense of connection that they felt with their ancestors and with the place they'd come from. This is just a few of them. The woman sitting down here on the step is Misty. She was the one who contacted me, and she is the mother of, this young woman and this one. Pictured with her are her brothers and her sisters. The event is a commemoration for their parents who'd lived in the house behind them for 43 years. They are just a few of the descendants of one of the Dunbar men. We think that George Darling's descendants neighbour somewhere in the region of 750 to 800 people. We're not quite sure. They're still trying to track each other down. And one of these days, I'd very much like to attend one of their gatherings. One of the striking things about the men from Dunbar, whom we know so little about so often, is that we know a huge amount about the impact they had on America. They didn't just build a new lives for themselves, you see. They built a nation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John and Rosie, there for that fascinating talk. I think you've given us a lot to think about there. Obviously now we're going to take questions. So if you have any questions, please send them through to Colin or to myself. And just to set the ball rolling, I've got a question here, which is, you mentioned female camp followers. Were there many of these? And what sort of roles did they actually fulfill? So I don't know, Rosie or John, which one of you would like to answer that one?
Will I take that?
Okay.
It was very common to find women on the battlefield. In the absence of a formal support structure, what we now call not logistics, they were the people who got the men there, kept them fed and clothed, provided medical care, took water onto the battlefield, and half the time carried the wounded off afterwards. It wasn't unusual for families to travel with their soldier fathers or brothers well into the 19th century. In fact, the French army at the Crimea had a formally organised group of women camp followers who were responsible for providing food and drink for the army.
Is there anything you want to ask, John?
No, that's absolutely fine. I think in relation to Dunbar, the one problem is we don't know how many women were with the army. We really just do not know. Clearly, there must have been quite a few. If Cromwell released a total of 5,000 POWs on the day of the battle or afterwards, then clearly there would be quite, as Rosie said, there would be quite a number of women. Now, many of these were soldiers' wives. They were not loose women. They were respectable women who were performing a vital function as part of the army at a time when there was no formal logistical tail. So I agree wholeheartedly with what Rosie says. And I think the answer would have to be there would be several thousand.
Right, thank you. Another question I've got, is there any suggestion that prisoners were selected for indenture linked to Sauga based on any experience in ironworking that they already had in Scotland? Speed's map of Scotland shows some ironworks, for example. So who wants to try that one?
Can I leap in again?
Right, yeah. Okay, off you go, Rosie.
Yeah, it's highly likely. What we do know is that some of the men who made it to Newcastle were actually taken off to help establish a linen weaving enterprise here. One of the fascinating things about the archaeology was that they found evidence of the linen trade on the teeth of some of the men who'd been buried in Durham. It's common to cut the threads by biting them, and eventually that wears channels in the teeth. So we suspect that at least some of the men who were taken off for that linen business and for the salt works had some experience there. It would be logical that they would use people with similar expertise when they got to the Americas. John, do you have anything to add to that?
Basically, obviously, if you've got a trade, then it ups your market value. And clearly, if you are going to make use of people, then it makes sense to use them in the trades to which they're already accustomed. And that's a big part of the benefit that they bring. Thank you.
Now, I've got a question myself. Obviously, being an archivist, I'm fascinated by how you find the sources that you've used to put your information together, because I know that you just don't find it all in one source. So what type of sources did you use, and where did you have to go to find that information? Because obviously you're dealing with two continents here. So what was there? Do you want to start on that one, Rosie?
Okay. Huge amount of thank you to all the people on this one, because we were not the first to look at this. The Durham team did an amazing job both on contacting descendants and on looking at what material was available here. The calendar of state papers has copies of correspondence between Cromwell and Hazelrig and other people involved in this, and that's freely available online. It's a huge resource and very interesting reading. John Moulton, a local historian, a Northumberland historian, had done a fair amount of work on this and had managed to track down not just the Hazelrig correspondence, but further details about some of the people mentioned in it. And then on the American side, the descendants have put together a very impressive website, which is constantly being updated, which uses lots of family history material. The very well-preserved archives of New England, which go right back into the first arrivals and which have been conserved in a way that does huge credit to them. At least 3 times, court records have been updated and preserved that might well have been left to moulder in some parts of Britain. And there are also lots of personal records that people have thrown into the pot. So the archive is actually growing as we speak. I suspect there will not be much of an end to that because people keep coming up with new material.
John, do you want to add anything there about this?
I think that's obviously exactly right. We also made free use of the Scottish National Archive, which is an excellent resource, and the library service in the Scottish Lothians Library Service were extremely helpful. I've got to say, very courteous. And we enjoyed some very interesting sessions in the library there. Echo what you said to start with, that I think archive research could be labelled as a Class A substance because one does indeed get addicted, there's no question.
Absolutely. And there are some stories that emerge from it that are just priceless. At Haddington, they've got the compensation claims for the townspeople who suffered quite heavily after the Cromwellian invasion. And there is one woman who puts in a claim for her son's best green breeches, which have been stolen by a Cromwellian soldier. You just get a feeling of that woman rising straight from the page at you.
I think it's all those personal touches that bring it to life, isn't it? And that's the whole point about it. You know, history is made up of people. And it's that bit that, that you want to bring out. And that's what makes it, it makes sense to people when they see that. Yeah. So I've got one more question. John made the point very clearly that the prisoners of war represented valuable assets. So why weren't they kept alive, all of them?
That's a good question. It makes sense. If you have valuable stock items, you look after them. Cromwell himself, I think, again, he's the commander-in-chief, therefore he has to carry responsibility. And it's no good just dumping the blame on Heselrig, because Heselrig, in a way, inherits the problem. What clearly had not been thought out, nobody seemed to have thought out a sensible and relatively safe mechanism for getting these men from Dunbar down to Durham. And we don't know who the officers were in charge. We do not know which Cromwellian officers were in charge of the various prisoners. Clearly, these were not senior officers. The generals, people like Fleetwood and Lambert, Monk and Cromwell, would be far too grand to have any hand in that. They would probably be, the task would be delegated to second echelon troops. And clearly these men were not properly led, they were not properly briefed, and they themselves appeared to be given no supply which to feed their men. So really, I think it's a mixture of callousness, indifference, and a significant failure of command and control. Yes, why husband a resource, why gather a resource and then waste it? It doesn't seem to make any sense. And it's clearly not, Cromwell he's not purging these men. He doesn't want to kill these men because they're not on humanitarian grounds, less humanitarian grounds, but the fact is they are valuable assets. And he's allowed, I think, through a failure of command, he's allowed his assets to be wasted.
John, would you like to talk about the cock-up element as well?
You may think that I couldn't possibly comment. If you've got a choice in history between conspiracy and cock-up, then I generally go for cock-up. And it's quite clear that, and Cromwell himself, to be fair, his men were in pretty poor shape in Dunbar. Their own supply chain was severely strained. The Navy, due to adverse weather, could only bring in so many supplies. We know the Scottish Army themselves had been very hungry before the battle. So it wasn't a case like Flodden where the Scots had this wonderful camp full of delicacies. No chance of that. There was very little food. Cromwell's men on the battlefield would have picked clean any available foodstuffs. So what should have happened, of course, had it been properly organised, was that Cromwell sort of set on ahead and arranged for depots to be set up at each of the staging points where the men could receive clean water, where they could receive adequate foodstuffs, and where, of course, they could receive at least cursory medical attention. And perhaps Cromwell or his underlings were mindful of the fact that these men were soldiers and that they could possibly cause a lot of trouble. The nearest parallel is the Bataan Death March in 1942 when the Japanese captured large numbers of Americans. We've got a lot of eyewitness testimony from men who survived this. And it's called the Death March for a reason. The Japanese behaved with extreme cruelty towards their prisoners and treated them as less than human. And I think that's what happened with these men. They were like and many of the men who would be leading them, guarding them, had fought the Irish the year before. I think they regarded the Scots as subhuman. Brutal and horrible as it seems, I think that's the way it was. They dehumanized these men. They had no personal stake. The individual trooper had no personal stake in the survival of these men. They were just an embarrassment, just a job to be got done. If they made it, fine. If they didn't make it, well, that was all the same, less to worry about. I think it was as callous and as basic as that.
I think there's an additional element, and that's that they made a bad mistake when they actually tried to help. In one of the slides that I put up, you saw Hazelrig talking about giving them bean water and milk. And I think that he was effectively killing them with kindness. If somebody's been starved for long enough, their body simply cannot cope with too rich a diet. If any of you have ever had to deal with a small baby who's had diarrhea, you'll know that these days you're asked to give them something to drink that contains a balance of salts and sugars. If you flood the body with too much nourishment, you throw the electrolytes out of balance and effectively you trigger organ failure. And we think that giving them food that they simply could not digest because they'd been hungry for so long may have been a significant factor in the deaths in Durham and Newcastle.
I think that's right. We have a modern parallel, which Rosie and I have looked at and talked about often, in the relief of Belston in 1945. British Tommies, member of the DLI, when they beheld the terrible spectacle of all these ghastly and emaciated victims, the first thing they tried to do, which was instinctive and it was meant as a kindness, they gave them their rations, gave them their British Army rations, which were heavily nutrient heavy. These was Maconochie stew, which would pretty much stop anybody's stomach. But for these poor people who had had no proper food for days and weeks, it actually killed hundreds of them. Not by deliberate intent, quite the reverse, trying to be kind. And I think Heselrig is right, he was in the same situation. He tried to do the best he could, but not knowing what he was doing, and actually simply compounded the problem.
Yeah, thank you. Now, one last question. This is probably, we've only got a couple of minutes on this one, but see where you go. Would the Scots and English have been able to understand one another's dialect?
That would depend.
That one you can still use today sometime.
Yeah, well, of course you can. And the fact is, there was no one dialect. Both armies would contain dialects from across both countries. So an Englishman, a Northumbrian, would understand a Scottish borderer. But if you had a man from the Isles, and we know there were a number of Highlanders, they would speak no English at all. They would speak only Gaelic, on the Irish tongue. And therefore none of the English would understand them. Also, let's say today, if you took a broad Glaswegian and dropped him down the Mile End Road to talk to a Southerner, neither would understand the other. Not now. So, and then, given that most of these people their lives didn't move out of their own areas, the linguistic barrier would be that much greater. And do bear in mind, a lot of the Scots, those from the West Coast and the Islands, almost certainly would not speak any English at all.
Right.
I come in there as well.
Yeah.
There's a record from, I think it's the Sarah, which lists the men who are on board. And it's very clear that you've got Gaelic speakers there because they've tried to spell their names phonetically. And you end up with things like donut for Duncan. And you can just hear somebody handing his name over and the recipient just having no idea what the hell they were talking about.
Yes, I can appreciate that because obviously I'm Irish, so the way that I speak isn't necessarily the way other people speak, and it's all the elongated vowels. Yeah. So yes, it's quite easily done, and maybe that makes a very valid point for people doing research.
Absolutely. Yeah. Do you bear that in mind? Yes, yeah.
In the past, and you have to remember that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I think that's all the questions that we've got time for tonight. But I think Rosie and John, hopefully that will encourage people to go and buy your book.
It's a good.
We live in,
and it's all there. And there is a special offer on. Pen and Sword are offering a 25% discount. If you buy the book through their website, and it's voucher 25 at the checkout. So I think definitely a lot of people that are here tonight will want to buy the book because you've really whetted everyone's with it.
Sure.
So, the Berwick Literary Festival, it is all run by volunteers and it doesn't receive any government support or funding, and it's all local people that do it. I myself know how much work actually goes into that because organising Heritage Open Days, I know the hours of work that the volunteers put in to make sure that everything runs smoothly. And obviously they've had the added challenge this year of putting it online. And I can say that is some feat doing that. So, if you do, if you have enjoyed tonight's event, please do consider making a donation to them. And there's information there in the chat box. Obviously, this is only day one of the festival. It goes on until Sunday, so there's still lots and lots of things for you all to attend. It's not only historical, there's lots of other talks about food and everything else. So please do support the festival, and so that, we can all prove that, we've tried our best this year. It's been trying times, but we've all tried our best. You may well receive a survey through your email about the event. So please do, reply to that. And also if you want to put anything on social media. And obviously I've been asked to remind you about the 2021 festival, which is going to take place between the 14th and the 17th of October next year. But let's get this festival out of the way first. And let's hope by then we'll be able to run more like in a normal event. Absolutely. So, that it could be in person. But I think, maybe what all of this is showing that, we can blend in person with other things as well. And just to finish, I would really, really like to thank Rosie and John for an excellent talk. I think you really have whetted our appetites with all this. And really, you've enlightened us on a period of history that people don't know a lot about. And it's also that's the connection that it had with America. It's always the irony, isn't it, when with a defeated force, where some of them end up. on what's happened to them, and actually that life has turned out really well for them. And I think that's the important lesson to come from it. And also, I think really the important thing is as well is to thank those that have come along this evening to enjoy this talk. You know, thank you for attending, and thank you for supporting the Literary Festival.